Good morning and welcome to the launch of the BCO research paper on the future of UK office densities. I'm Suzanne Gill. I'm a partner in the commercial property team at Wedlake Bell, and I'm delighted to welcome our panel and, of course, so many of you here today for this launch paper. Tim Altman is the founder and CEO of Leesman, the world's foremost index on employee workplace experience, and of course the Leesman Index. It's used by industry thought leaders throughout the world, with over 900,000 users responses across more than 6,000 workplaces. He will be followed by Rod Bunn, who teaches on the UCL Built Environment courses with a track record in researching the performance of buildings from their energy and carbon dioxide emissions to measuring the comfort and satisfaction of their occupants. And our third presenter this morning will be Nigel Osland, an environmental psychologist, workplace strategist, change manager and author. He's currently mainly focused on his consulting practice, but continues to carry out independent research, lecture and publish. And we're very grateful to all three of them and to Tim's colleague, Michael Hadcox at Leesman, for their work in preparing the report, which will be available to download for BCO members in the next few days. After their presentation, we will have a panel discussion with Q&A, and I'm pleased to be joined by Bridget Workman, who leads the Changing Workplace company, offering tailored training and consultancy at the intersection of smart working and change management. She's been instrumental in the development of office efficiency and effectiveness data for the UK government and adoption of its workplace density standards. And also by Claire Danahay, the founder of Be Inspired Design. She's got 20 years experience in commercial interior design, supporting clients to improve business efficiency through detailed evidence-based research. She's a regional committee member of the BCO in the north of England and part of the BCO's Technical Affairs Committee. So, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much. Right, morning everybody. What a period we're trying to work through, a period of unprecedented change. It doesn't need me to sort of amplify for you the world that you're working in, the world that we're all working in as practitioners in this area is moving at such pace, not least because of the pandemic, but also all of the other aspects of the global economy that are now hyperinflation, energy pricing, etc., just really creating this sort of pressure pot in the current climate, which means that one of the BCO's most common incoming questions is quite simply occupant density, how many people in space. It seems strange that amongst all this complexity, that's the one question which is the most common, but maybe that talks to the impact of the economics of corporate workplace in terms of how many people you can squeeze in directly relates to the operating cost of property on an organisation's bottom line. There are many other topics, obviously, that we could weave around this, but what we're going to try and talk to you today is the work that Nigel, Rod, Michael and I have been doing over the last few months to try and understand what the current situation is. And the one thing I would say is that I sit in between two esteemed academics. I'm not an academic. I have 4 of them on my team, but that is not the purpose of me here today. I'm here, almost here and in the research project to represent the commercial interest of the organisations that we work with around the world. And the data that we bring to the party that we've gifted to the project is around the employee's individual experience. So if you like, the end customer of everything that you are responsible for in your professional practices and the work that we do from a research perspective together on this and around and on this project. In terms of context, I mean, just looking longitudinally, even at the BCO's data, you can see what's been happening to the occupant density of workplace in the UK over the last sort of 12 or so years. We haven't particularly been looking at why this has happened. I'm sure we could debate afterwards over coffee why we think some of these sort of reverse hockey sticks are happening, but it's quite interesting for me if I think about what I was doing in around about sort of 99 and 2000 working with BT as CRT monitors started to disappear from workstations, and those of you old enough to remember corner core workstations were being skipped and rectangular workstations started to come in. And then in 2009, we see the arrival of flat screen technology, mobile digital computing, the launch of the iPad in 2009, and then suddenly a sort of flat line from there on. So clearly there's lots happening around this, not just economics. There's the advancement of technology and specifically around mobile technology in the workplace that's very directly impacting this. But the question still remains, what is happening to occupant density in workplaces, and what can you take away as guidance for the clients that you work with and the BCO's design standards that will feed through? Nigel's going to talk a little bit more about that in terms of the current state of play. So 35% reduction over that cycle. Thankfully, it is flatlining. That isn't a trend that looks like it's going to continue at the same pace. But what does that mean in terms of occupant experience? So Leesman started back in 2010 with one single objective: to measure the experience that employees have of workplaces. We do nothing else whatsoever. There's no consultancy or advisory advice. I guess in common parlance, we're a pre and post occupancy evaluation technique. It's wider than that, and clients use it for other purposes, including change management. But that's all we sell. It's just one standard evaluation technique. As as we said in the introduction, nearly 1 million respondents now today. We've got a number of major surveys live at the moment. And this is some of the data we collect from our high performance workplaces. So these are workplaces that achieve a standard of 70 or above on our 0 to 100 index. So it's a small group. Nigel and I talked about the Leesman Index when I started it and conceived it back in 2009. And maybe, in reflection, one of the things I should have done is asked every respondent, every client respondent, to tell us how much space we're existing in the nearly 6,000 workplaces that we measured. We didn't do that. I regret it now, but maybe we can change that. But we do it for all of our high performance workplaces. So I do know, and we can talk to the impact of space and occupant density in high performance. So these are spaces that work well for the employee, for the end customer of the design of those spaces. And you can see across all of the countries that those spaces have been reported in, the hugely different outcomes. And Nigel and I were talking just before, there's quite a fashion, I think, in the UK to look to some of our near neighbours for innovation in terms of where the future of workplace might go. From my perspective, I think the Netherlands has been sort of 5 to 10 years ahead of us for certainly as long as I've been around corporate workplace. And I think we look in envy at Finland because they're such happy people, and try and understand whether this has any impact on them at all. Who knows, right? But I think the point of this slide is that high performance workplace, and that's from a Leesman perspective, high performance means high occupant satisfaction, which has a roll-on effect because it also means high personal sense of productivity, high sense of enjoyment, knowledge transfer, all of the other metrics that the organizations want to understand in terms of the value of workplace. You can see here that space doesn't impact the experience that these employees are having of the spaces. And as somebody trained as a designer a long time ago, what we're seeing here is great design, and the relationship with occupant density is pretty loose across these spaces. Nigel and Rod will talk more to this in their deeper dive within the data. So that's the sort of context of the exercise that we've had to undertake. And I have to tell you, for three people who know each other quite well, some of the arguments professionally that we've had over the last few months would give you some indication of quite how difficult this has been as an exercise. To arrive at a single number that the BCO can use as guidance to its members and wider, that gives some sense of where the world is today. I think we came close at one point to saying, do you know what? This isn't possible. This is too hard because there are so many moving parts. And I think we have to reflect that we are mid-experiment, right? What has happened to us in the last 2 years is unprecedented, but it is still moving. The sands are still shifting. So I would ask you, if you like, from the commercial perspective, to think in terms of the work that you are doing, to really appraise the position today and what position that client might be in 3 or 5 years in the future. We can see here in Northern Europe, 20 square meters per person compared to what we're currently pacing in our UK client base at the moment at somewhere near 10 square meters per person. Now, again, these are all high performance workplaces. So here, ultimately, employee experience and occupant density do not directly correlate as causation. Now, in terms of the process for the project, there were 3 major parts to the project that Nigel guided: the literature review, the longitudinal analysis, and then this particular subsets of data that we were able to extract from our database. Supplementary interviews, BCO member surveys, maybe some of you participated in those surveys. Nigel's going to talk you through those. and a workshop that we hosted at our office that deep dives some of the questions and some of the points that came out of that. The research report, which, as we said, is going to be downloadable shortly, is the outcome, and that will directly feed into the design guidelines that are currently being finalised. So, research findings. I'm just going to take you through the first two because they're very specific Leesman data. I'm not going to narrate the slide. You can see quite clearly what is happening here. That the world has changed in terms of the perception of how often employees need to return to their workplaces. These numbers have seemingly settled in the last 3 to 4 months. Up until then, the numbers were going up and down all over the place, right? So I think we're in a position now where numbers will start to normalize and we can start to observe some sort of consistent patterning. But you can see the big strike here. That 2 days a week is starting to emerge for many corporate organizations as the likely use pattern for corporate workplaces in the future. 51% in that group are planning to be in with the most popular at 2 days. In terms of the space use, think not of occupant density at the moment, but things of total space use. And you can do your own maths in terms of the future projection for the volume of space that organizations will need. Now, how they use the space that they keep really is the ultimate question that you've got to try and probe next. Only 18% of respondents in more than 2 days a week. And we've got a fresh research briefing ourselves next week, which will probe the reasons why people are moving in this way between workplaces. Nigel put the acronym at the end. I'm not going to use it, but you see what's happening. Now, what is happening with the clients that we work with at the moment on the occupancy evaluations is clear, and it's here, and it's, you know, it's undeniable. That is the pattern that is happening across the world, pretty much. There are a couple of geographies where it's slightly different. But what is also happening behind the scenes is chief finance officers are getting into discussions with their CHROs and their property directors and saying, well, this is all fairly well and good, but we can't sustain empty offices on a Friday and a Monday. So the next thing that I would contest that you're going to have to think through is what happens when you load balance these across a full working week, and you stop giving employees full freedom of choice, and you start somehow massaging or nudging who uses the space on what days. And this is where then Nigel's going to take you through some deeper diving in the data. We should say, feel free to snap the slides. These are quite complex, some of the stuff that's coming up, especially when Rod gets going on some of the more academic stuff. But the report will be published in the next couple of days. There you go. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I'm just going to step in, just do a couple of slides and then hand back over to Rod. And one of the methods that we used is we ran a members survey. We had about 270 people participate, 200 or so completed surveys, and we had some very simple questions. Thanks, by the way, to everyone who responded. And we asked people, for example, about how often they're going to be in the office, or their colleagues are in the office before lockdown, during lockdown, and what do they think it's planned. Those are the kind of numbers that came out. So you can see there was a dip, but it's going to recover a little bit. And then just quite a complicated chart, but we then started saying, but when are these people coming in? And you can see, again, the Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday pattern coming through. But what's surprising is that roughly 2/3 of the respondents are saying they expect 60–80% of people in on those 3 days. So as Tim said, this presents a challenge when you're looking at utilisation and densities, this kind of midweek hump, if you like. And the one thing we definitely learned from all our research is it's quite difficult to join the dots. We're hearing very different stories from different sources, whether it's Leesman, the members survey, or things like this. Remit Consulting, they collate the occupancy levels in their own building stock. And when you look at this, you know, you're only seeing peaks of around 30%. Which again is quite different to the figures I've shown you earlier. So it's actually quite difficult to collate it and try and bring together a coherent story, and that was the job. That's why we called it a triangulation. It's what data have we got, and how does that support our views of what's happening as well. And just going forward, we asked well, what are you going to do? What have you been doing? What are you going to do in terms of occupancy levels and utilization? And you can see that the big spike in the middle there is the balance of space. So our respondents were saying what they're going to look at is, ratio of desks to other types of spaces. Is it more collaboration space, or is it more space for concentration? We all think that we need space for collaboration, get people back in the office, social interaction. We're all missing out. We want to connect. But actually, there's quite a lot of people at home who just can't work in that environment. They don't have the luxury of an enclosed private space at home. They might be flat sharing or have dependents around them. So they want to come in the office to focus and concentrate and to get mentored and all of those things. And then you can see at the top, some of you saying we're still planning to reduce desks. We're planning to reduce office space as well, but it's not completely across the board. So mixed views. And there you go. So 1/3 have already implemented agile working, but it certainly looks to me like this is becoming more and more the norm, as you might expect, the hybrid working, but with the hot desking, desk sharing added on. So I'm going to hand over to Rod now, who's going to tell you about some of his fantastic research on density effects.
Right, good morning. Yes, as I'm not sure I'm esteemed, but I do regard myself as a research scientist. I have no commercial interest in this subject at all. I work with data and I try and find out what the data is telling me. And this work formed part of a doctoral research project. Now, in terms of, before I get into this, I'll tell you what I did. I studied the same buildings, which were known buildings, office buildings, over a number of years. The longest period of which a building was studied was 21 years. I mean, using the same methods of analysis, the same data analysis, the same survey technique every time. So the data then is comparable. Okay, that's the key thing. If any of those things change, the methodology, the survey technique or whatever, then it's not truly longitudinal. This is studying how a number of offices changed over time. I wasn't intending to research density per se. I wanted to know whether the occupant responses to an occupant survey were valid, or whether humans are just a random number generator. Because we are loosely calibrated, we are humans, okay? So the question for me at the beginning of all of this was, can we trust what people say in surveys? Which of course Tim would say yes, but it depends very much on the survey and the questions that you're asking. So that is the longitudinal survey. And these buildings that I studied are named buildings. So the headquarters of National Trust, for example, in Swindon, office buildings at the University of East Anglia, and the headquarters of Hampshire County Council in Winchester. And I'm happy to mention these buildings. And you chart them. The most important thing is to know what's happening in those buildings. One of the things that happened in those three buildings and others was that the population density increased over time. And in one of them, it moved from 475 at design to 900. So now you're seeing there's a big change in the occupancy of those buildings. Question is, did it have an effect? So for those of you at the back of the room, you're going to struggle with some of these slides. But let me explain what's going on so you can follow it. Along here, we have workstation density. Now, it's kind of workstation population density because you have to measure this accurately. You can't work with NIA. That's not good enough. You have to work with the area that people actually occupy if you're going to ask them questions about that area that they actually occupy. What we got here is a 7-point scale, 1 to 7. And this is scores for perceived density. 1, too few people, 7, too many. And the other thing we can do here is that we've got a scale on the other side of the chart that we can use for another value. Let's say lighting or noise or satisfaction with toilets, some functional features. So we can plot the data on the same chart. So this is the question about perceived density. We ask people, are there too few or too many people in your office? And this is not longitudinal because we only do this for the last surveys. And the data looks like this. Now, there's a number of things about this data that you need to be aware of before you start interrogating. First thing is that one person, any data from above 1 person per 12, I've got 3 buildings. It's a very small data set. However, it's not about the number, it's the spatial representation that's vital and the level of detail for each of those offices or subtenancies or separate floors. You need to know a lot about the detail. You can't just, have a survey response. You need to know a lot about those numbers. So about very few numbers, but sorry, very few buildings in this example, above 1 to 12, but nonetheless very rich data. And these are mean scores on the 1 to 7 scale. Okay, now you could show the distribution on this, but it'd get terribly, terribly complicated. So the other thing to say about this is that people say, okay, Rod, can you generalize on this? You go, well, you've got air-conditioned offices, you've got naturally ventilated, you've got mixed mode, you've got city centre, you've got rural, you've got suburban. There are many differences between these offices as there are commonalities. But the key thing about this, there's nothing below the line, the midpoint 4, at densities above 10. There's nothing here. It's all above the line. So people are saying, yeah, you know what? There are too many people in the place where I work. So their perception of density tracks the actual measurements that I made for the areas that they occupied. Okay. So now we can say, right, well, let's put another variable on this side of the chart. And one thing we can do with this is reverse the, well, some of the variables already have reverse scores. But you can actually, if they don't, you can reverse the 1 to 7 scale. So you get a crossover point. Do you follow? So let's do scores for noise. So here we have these are paired buildings. They're paired scoring. So we can see that there's a crossover at about 1 to 10, and we can see that people are saying it's not terribly noisy, but it's not brilliant either. So it's quite a weak relation. It's quite a weak evidence for increased or intolerable noise as perceived density goes up against actual density. But then nonetheless, there is a trend there. When you know, what we want is more data this side of the scale, of course, to firm this up. So that's noise. So their scores for noise are overall. I think is it too little noise or too much noise. But when we look at health, and we do the same thing. 1 is unhealthy, 7 is more healthy from the perception of the occupants. You can see a much clearer relationship between their perception of density and their perception of health. And they're saying, yeah, it's below. All the scores are below the scale midpoint. So you go, okay, well, that's kind of interesting, but it's not definitive data. I'm not suggesting it is definitive data. What I should have said at the beginning is that I do built environment surveys. Same as a workplace doesn't use a workplace survey. They're also health and well-being surveys. They do share commonalities, but they're very different orientations. So I come at this from a built environment perspective, not a workplace perspective. I should have said that at the beginning. So now another thing we can do here is look at perceived productivity. Anyone that says they can measure actual productivity in a real building is probably telling porkies, because it's extremely difficult to do. But you can ask about perceived productivity. And when you do this, you get that relationship. Now, it just so happens it'll take too long to explain, but the survey technique that I use puts perceived productivity on a 1 to 9 scale. So you would imagine that the slope of the data would be flatter. If I normalized it to 1 to 7, it'd be steeper. Okay. But again, we can see people are saying they're not as productive as they could be because they're in a highly dense environment. Or the denser it gets, but it's still not that definitive. However, when you put it all together, if it quacks like a duck and it flaps like a duck and it paddles like a duck, it's kind of a duck. So the question is, what is the value we shouldn't go below? And again, I've only got 10 minutes. I can't go into a great deal of detail, but I had buildings on my database that had densities below 7 square meters per person. And that was way too dense. One of the buildings, you had 2 desks and somebody sitting officially across between the legs of those 2 desks. That was that person's workplace. They had squeezed 3 people into 2 desks. So you would imagine that those people would have an opinion about their productivity, about their perceived health, and about various other comfort factors. So the data are not definitive. I'm not standing up in front of you here to claim it as such. But what we're saying here is density is an issue. Don't go below 1 per 10 unless you're aware of the potential risks and your ability to manage them. And it covers a multitude of variables. The key one, the canary in the coal mine, is always satisfaction with toilets. That's the one that goes tilt. That's the one that goes tilt first, right? Then you see it very clearly. I would suggest that anything below 8 meters per person incurs a perceived fall, if not actual falls in human performance, however you wish to measure human performance. it is a tricky area. The only obvious motivation for excessive density, it seems to me, is to reduce rental costs. So why the hell should we be doing this going forwards? Now, post-pandemic, all the things that Tim has said and Nigel has said about utilisation being far less, that's fine as long as organisations don't corral people into smaller areas, because the problems will just reoccur. So we shouldn't be going there. This is covered in much more detail in the report, which is out. So if anybody wants to contact me afterwards and say, I'm sorry, can you give more detail? I'm quite happy to do so. And I think at that point, I pass it to Nigel.
Thanks, Rod. Yeah, I was quite excited when Rod said he was happy to join the team and share some of his data and his insights. It's not very often you get that level of detailed analysis over 20 years. But as well as the Leesman Index analysis, as well as Rod's analysis, we did a literature review and we did a survey. Now, the thing with the literature review, which I conducted, again, it just wasn't clear. First of all, there's not actually that many studies conducted in the real world that look at the impact of density on workers' health and performance and so on, which is why Rod's data was really good. Quite often it was confounded with open plan. A lot of studies were saying they're looking at open plan versus private offices. You could unravel a bit of density if you liked. But when you looked at all the data, the literature review, and I actually only found 23 what I considered decent studies on density, but they did use different metrics. 80% of them indicated there was a negative impact of high density on people. However, as I state there, it was quite a weak relationship. It's, you know, you've got to kind of squint and look between the lines. So there is a relationship, but it's a weak one. And the reason it's weak is because of all those other variables, all those other factors in the real world. So the spatial ones, for example, I've just mentioned, a lot of the studies were confounded with open plan. Desk spacing compared to other kinds of work settings, whether people were hot desking or not, all these things affect the impact of density on the occupants. And then the work, the kind of work they're doing, you know, when you look at whether they're hybrid working, agile working, what are the work patterns, all these things are confounding factors. And then the final set of factors that seem to affect the results are the kind of more personal and organizational ones. Cultural differences, tenure differences. Some of them looked at how long were you in the organisation. People who were there for longer might expect more space and lower densities than people who are just joining the organisation. So it's really difficult to actually find some decent data to inform us and BCO. Oh, I got another bit of Leesman data. So how did that pop in there? So again, Michael and Tim's team, they did look at a lot of different variables and looked at the impact of density on various variables. And quite often there was no correlation or very weak correlations. This one, it did actually start to show something when we started to break down clusters of buildings, those 74 buildings Tim mentioned, and we split them up into the high to low density. You start to see that the lower the density, the more positive people were about and proud they were to bring people to their space, which obviously has implications for things like the design of the space, the facilities, the client-facing areas, and so on. Is that fair to say, Tim? This one comes from the survey that some of you conducted. Thanks again for that. So 200 odd respondents. What I've done is I've grouped the data into your estimated floor density and then correlated that with your mean satisfaction rating. And again, you know, a correlation, actually 0.37 for psychologists is a great correlation. We'll take that any day. We're not physicists. But so, you know, there is a correlation there, which basically saying, yeah, density has an impact on our satisfaction with the space. So a few more findings. We also looked at planned densities, both again in terms of the literature and also the surveys. So back to the survey, we're asking people about, are you going to change the density? And you can see quite a big portion saying, no, we're going to keep the density the same. Obviously, a lot of, about a fifth had already said that they'd gone through changing their density during lockdown. But only a very small proportion, 13%, said they're going to reduce density going forward. And of course, what's most disappointing for us is the 8% who say they're going to increase density. But it may be that that particular group had reduced density during lockdown, so they were going to increase it back to what it was. Unfortunately, we can't interrogate that further. And then, are you going to do any hot desking? Are you going to do any desk sharing? And again, you can see that, yeah, it's definitely on the cards for certainly for the organisations of the respondents. Only 1/5 saying that they're going to continue with one-to-one desking, and desk sharing is going to become more and more the norm. Again, the big clusters around the 10 to 8, 10 to 7. Which is kind of 10 to 6 even, which is what we certainly as a consultant I've been seeing over the last few years. So it looks like desk sharing is the new norm. I hate that phrase, but there you go. We also, bit of a strange, we should get an axis there with no graph, but we also asked you about, can you estimate your current floor densities and what your planned floor densities are? On average, the current was 9 square meters, a slight reduction in density or more space per person planned going forward, but a lot of people just saying it's too early to call it. When we do look at the chart, it looks something like this, and you can see clearly that there's clusters of 8, 10, 12. It seems to be like even numbers over odd numbers for some reason, but they were estimates, so I understand that. But I think you can see that where there is high density, so when it's kind of down here, the blue is the current, we can see a shift maybe from the 5s to the 6s to 7s, and you can see that there's a shift from the 8, 9 to 10s. Possibly to the 11 and 12s, but it's marginal. But so yeah, as this average indicates, a slight reduction in density, more space per person, but not the massive change that I thought we might see. And yeah, one of the questions BCO asked us as well, does that vary by sector and fit out date and all this? And I didn't find any statistically significant differences within the survey as to all these. It was more about activity. What is the activity of the organisation, not necessarily the sector. And even within an organisation, the activity of the department, so finance versus sales and so on, you'll see differences, but not across regions and so on. So what are the implications of all this very messy research for BCO? Because I mean, we're kind of being frank with you here. You know, we collated this information, but it wasn't as clean and easy as we thought, so we kind of had to bring it together. But there are implications for BCO. Back to the occupancy levels. So again, if you take all the data, we're doing our best. When you look at the traditional office, so one-to-one desking, it's quite a range. It's 6 to 80%. But I think that 60 to 80% is affected by the mid-week peaks, which makes it really difficult because should we be designing for 80% occupancy or 60% occupancy? Can we manage that across the week so that we actually get a more realistic figure? That's traditional. When you look at agile workplaces, as you might expect, the planned occupancy levels are lower. What they mean is the number of people within the organisation expected on any day. Of course, in terms of density, if you are implementing an agile workplace, you're probably going to take some space away. So actually the density of anything will go up, even though the utilisation of the population is lower, but day to day, the actual utilisation of the space is likely to go up. If it doesn't, you're doing something wrong. Agile working isn't working. We also asked about the metrics, because again, when you're going through the literature review and you're looking at Rod's data and Tim's data and all the published benchmarks on density, they all use different metrics. So you're kind of trying to work out how the different metrics combine and how you can compare apples with pears and so on. But you can see from this that the kind of meter squared per person is from your point of view, from the survey, seems to be the most popular. And I'm reading that, though, per person, again, it's confusing because some people see per person as actually per head count. Others consider it to be the number of people in the office. So again, you're trying to unravel that. And then we start asking people about, well, are you talking about the floor, the building, just the desk area like Rod used? And again, kind of split views on what's the best metric. And in terms of our report, we kind of went with the per person one. But the per person one, I should say, it's a funny one. If you're one-to-one desking, traditional, that per person is your population, the people assigned to that building. Of course, if you're hot desking, you're doing agile working, hybrid working, the per person is the number of people you're planning to be in the space, not the utilization, but the people, the proportion of your headcount that you expect to be in the space. So almost the maximum number of people at any time. So even that's a confusing term, but it's the best we could come to. We thought the per person one wrapped things up a lot better than per desk. Forget it, doesn't work anymore. And so on. And then the other thing is we're saying across the main office floors rather than special nice floors like this one. We've gone for when you're trying to get a single number, we've gone for a typical office floor. And bringing all that research together, all that messy research together, you kind of come up with these kind of numbers. Acceptable above 10 square meters, slightly more risky 9 and below. And as Rod said, by the time you get below 8, well, please don't do it. but then above 10 is great. Again, looking at the survey data and looking at previous benchmarks, 10 to 12 seems to be the kind of magic number. But of course, if you go above 12, you may get other benefits. Except at some point it will drop off. You then get that issue of losing space efficiency over the performance of your staff and so on. So 10 to 12 seems to be the number. 10 square meters of the planned occupancy is a good starting point. But even that's not the answer. We're saying 10 is a great starting point, but then you've got to consider the activities going on in the space, and it may go up or higher. You need to consider other factors that affect density. So ultimately, you might come to, you start with 10, you might do a little bit of interrogation, and then you can come down to what you think is the right planning density. When we spoke to a lot of the interviewees in particular, they were saying it's not that simple. It's, we shouldn't really come up with a single number because there's so many confounding factors and we need to consider this, that and the other. But it is useful to have a number, they were saying. So we need a rule of thumb. So even then we were getting mixed views. BCO introduced effective density a few years ago now. So again, you might come up with planning density, but then your utilization levels will affect your effective density. So you might want to consider that as well.